Have you ever wondered what the person next to you is really thinking? That barista who seems effortlessly cool, the businessman scrolling through his phone, your coworker who always looks like they got their life figured out? Well, what if I told you that someone actually found out, and it wasn't what anyone expected? What if the greatest superpower turned out to be the cruelest joke the universe could play? But here's the cosmic joke the universe just played on you. You can only hear their envious thoughts. That's it. Not their love, not their hopes, not their brilliant ideas or creative sparks. Just pure, unadulterated envy. Every bitter comparison, every resentful glance, every "why them and not me" that crosses their minds becomes your personal soundtrack. Think about it for a second. Right now, as you're listening to this, someone somewhere is looking at your life and feeling envious about something you have. Maybe your freedom to listen to podcasts, your ability to understand English, or simply the fact that you're not stuck in their particular situation. And if you had this power, their envious thought about you would be the only thing you'd hear from their mind. This isn't just some random thought experiment. This is about the most universally human emotion we never want to admit we have. Envy is like that embarrassing relative we all have but pretend doesn't exist at family gatherings. It's the emotional equivalent of intestinal gas. Everyone produces it, but nobody wants to acknowledge it in polite society. But what if envy, this supposedly ugly emotion, was actually trying to tell us something profound about human nature? What if it was like a twisted GPS system, constantly recalculating the route to what we think will make us happy? And what would happen if someone could actually map out all these envious thoughts, creating a real-time heat map of human desire and dissatisfaction? The story I'm about to tell you explores exactly that scenario. It's about Marcus, an ordinary guy who stumbles into this extraordinary curse, or is it a gift, and discovers that having access to humanity's envious thoughts isn't just uncomfortable. It's a front row seat to the theater of human absurdity. Because here's what makes this particularly twisted. Envy isn't random. It follows patterns, creates hierarchies, and reveals the secret mathematics of social comparison that governs our daily lives. And once you can see those patterns, you start to realize that maybe the real question isn't why people are envious. It's why we're all so desperately convinced that everyone else has figured out something we haven't. So buckle up, because we're about to dive into a world where thoughts become audible, where privacy is just a memory, and where one man's accidental superpower becomes humanity's most uncomfortable mirror. Marcus Chun had always been what you might generously call perfectly average. At 32, he occupied that sweet spot of mediocrity that makes you invisible in crowds and forgettable at parties. He worked in IT support, not the cool, hacker genius kind, but the have you tried turning it off and on again variety. His apartment was adequately furnished with furniture that could have come from any catalog, and his social life consisted mainly of Netflix and the occasional beer with Dave from accounting. The morning everything changed started like every other morning. Marcus woke up to his phone alarm, stumbled to the bathroom, and caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror. Slightly overweight, hair pointing in 3 different directions, wearing the same gray t-shirt he'd worn to bed for the past week. He was brushing his teeth when the first thought hit him, like a mental slap. God, I wish I had his metabolism. Look at him just standing there. Probably never counted a calorie in his life. Marcus stopped mid-brush and looked around his empty bathroom. The voice was clear as day, but there was no one there. He shrugged it off as morning grogginess and continued getting ready. But then, as he walked to the kitchen, another voice invaded his head. Must be nice to afford a 1-bedroom in this neighborhood. Some of us are stuck with roommates at 32. This time Marcus actually spun around, toothpaste foam still clinging to his chin. His upstairs neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, was apparently standing directly above him, and somehow he could hear her thoughts. But that was impossible. People don't just develop telepathy overnight, especially not people like Marcus who couldn't even remember to water their one pathetic succulent. The commute to work turned into a symphony of mental voices, each one dripping with resentment. On the subway, a businessman in an expensive suit was thinking, "Look at this guy, probably doesn't have a care in the world. No mortgage, no kids, no pressure, just coasting through life." A college student with a backpack full of textbooks was radiating envy about Marcus's apparent freedom from student loans. An elderly woman was jealous of his knees, which presumably didn't creak when he stood up. It was like being trapped in a feedback loop of human dissatisfaction, and Marcus was somehow the focal point. At work, the phenomenon intensified. Sarah from HR walked past his cubicle, and her thoughts crashed into his consciousness. I bet he goes home every day at exactly 5 p.m. No overtime, no taking work home. Must be nice to have a job where you can just disconnect. Even Dave, his drinking buddy from accounting, wasn't immune. As they passed in the hallway, Marcus heard, "Lucky bastard. No girlfriend means no expensive dinners, no Valentine's gifts, no pressure to remember anniversaries. He probably saves a fortune." By lunch, Marcus had compiled an inadvertent catalog of everything people envied about his thoroughly unremarkable life. His ability to eat lunch alone without feeling self-conscious. His lack of social media presence that freed him from the exhausting performance of online happiness. His simple wardrobe that never required difficult fashion choices. Even his slightly receding hairline was envied by a completely bald coworker who thought, "At least he still has something to work with up there." The realization hit him like a philosophical freight train. He was living inside other people's version of the grass is greener. Every single thing about his life that he considered boring or insufficient was simultaneously someone else's definition of enviable freedom. But the real existential crisis came when he tried to test his newfound ability. He concentrated hard, trying to hear people's thoughts about love, or their creative ideas, or their hopes for the future. Nothing. It was like his brain had been equipped with the world's most specific radio antenna, permanently tuned to the frequency of human envy. Marcus spent his lunch break sitting in the company parking lot, watching people walk by and inadvertently conducting a real-time survey of human dissatisfaction. A jogger envied his ability to sit still. A person on their phone envied his apparent disconnection from digital drama. Someone carrying coffee envied what they perceived as his contentment with plain water. It was then that Marcus began to understand the cruel irony of his situation. He had been granted access to the human mind, but only to its pettiest, most corrosive thoughts. He was like a scientist studying human nature who could only observe specimens through a microscope calibrated exclusively for emotional parasites. The afternoon brought a parade of envious thoughts about his job security, his apparent lack of workplace drama, and even his cubicle's proximity to the window. By the time 5 o'clock rolled around, Marcus felt like he'd been subjected to a psychological waterboarding session conducted entirely by people who thought his life was somehow better than theirs. Walking home, he realized that he was now privy to the secret ingredient in the recipe of human misery, the constant, subconscious comparison that everyone was making with everyone else. And apparently, his perfectly average life was hitting some kind of sweet spot in the collective imagination. Not successful enough to inspire admiration, but comfortable enough to trigger the particular brand of resentment reserved for people who seem to have figured out something the rest of us are missing. The second day of Marcus's accidental telepathy brought a revelation that would make even the most cynical philosopher weep. Envy, it turned out, was humanity's most democratic emotion. It didn't discriminate based on age, gender, social status, or intelligence. Everyone, absolutely everyone, was walking around with a mental inventory of what other people had that they wanted. Marcus decided to conduct what he generously called field research, which was really just him wandering around the city like a psychological voyeur, collecting envious thoughts like a demented anthropologist. His first stop was the local coffee shop, where he discovered that the barista with the perfectly crafted latte art was envious of his customers' ability to afford a $4 coffee without checking their bank balance first. Meanwhile, that same customer, a woman in expensive athletic wear, was radiating resentment about Marcus's apparent freedom from the tyranny of morning workouts. He probably woke up naturally instead of forcing himself to a 6 a.m. spin class, her mind complained. Some people just get to be comfortable in their own skin without all this effort. The woman behind her in line was envious of athletic or a lady's obvious financial security, while simultaneously resenting Marcus's presumed lack of body image issues. It was like watching a three-way psychological Mexican standoff, where everyone was armed with assumptions and loaded with dissatisfaction. Marcus ordered his coffee and sat down to observe this fascinating ecosystem of mutual envy. A group of college students at a nearby table were looking at him and thinking variations of Must be nice to be done with school, but he doesn't have to worry about finals. And look at him just sitting there. Probably has a steady income and everything figured out. Meanwhile, Marcus was sitting there having an existential crisis about his complete inability to figure out anything, which would have been ironic if irony wasn't rapidly becoming the dominant theme of his entire existence. The real breakthrough came when he noticed a pattern in the envious thoughts. They weren't actually about what people had. They were about what people imagined others felt. The barista wasn't really envious of $4. She was envious of the perceived ease of spending $4. The athletic woman wasn't envious of Marcus's body. She was envious of what she imagined was his mental comfort with his body. Everyone was essentially envious of fictional emotional states they were attributing to other people. This revelation sent Marcus down a rabbit hole of philosophical questions that would have made Socrates proud and probably given him a migraine. If everyone was envious of everyone else's imagined inner peace, and no one actually had inner peace, then what exactly was everyone chasing? It was like a massive pyramid scheme, but instead of money, everyone was trying to achieve a state of contentment that existed only in other people's assumptions about other people's lives. Marcus decided to test this theory by visiting different social environments. At the gym, he discovered that fit people were envious of his apparent freedom from the pressure to maintain physical perfection. Look at that guy, thought a bodybuilder whose muscles had muscles. He doesn't have to spend 2 hours a day in here just to feel adequate. At the library, students were envious of his presumed freedom from academic pressure, while simultaneously, a graduate student working on her thesis was radiating resentment about his apparent lack of intellectual anxiety. Must be nice to not constantly question whether you're smart enough, her mind whispered. In the park, parents were envious of his childless freedom, while at the same time, an elderly man feeding pigeons was jealous of Marcus's youth and possibility. Everyone was looking at the same unremarkable person and seeing their personal definition of having it figured out. The most disturbing discovery came when Marcus realized that he was probably broadcasting his own envious thoughts to someone else with a similar curse. Somewhere out there, another accidental mind reader was picking up on his resentment about people who seemed genuinely happy, people who had close friendships, people who knew what they wanted to do with their lives. This led to what Marcus would later refer to as the great recursive envy panic of Tuesday afternoon. If everyone was envious of everyone else's imagined emotional states, and those emotional states were largely fictional, then the entire human experience was basically an elaborate game of psychological telephone, where everyone was desperately trying to achieve a state of being that existed only in other people's misunderstanding of their lives. Marcus sat on a park bench, surrounded by the white noise of envious thoughts, and realized he had stumbled onto something bigger than a personal superpower. He had discovered the operating system of human dissatisfaction. Every advertising campaign, every social media post, every lifestyle article was essentially weaponizing this fundamental misunderstanding about what other people's lives were really like. The fashion industry survived by convincing people that others were effortlessly stylish. The fitness industry thrived on the assumption that some people found exercise naturally enjoyable. The self-help industry existed entirely because everyone thought everyone else had access to some secret knowledge about happiness and fulfillment. And here was Marcus, accidentally equipped with the ability to hear the raw data that proved it was all a magnificent delusion. Everyone was envious. Everyone was struggling. Everyone was looking at everyone else and thinking, they must have figured out something I haven't. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus began to feel like he was carrying the weight of humanity's collective emotional confusion. Every envious thought he heard was both heartbreaking and absurd. Heartbreaking because it revealed genuine human pain, and absurd because it was based on complete misunderstandings about what other people's experiences were actually like. The cruel irony wasn't lost on him. He now knew more about the human condition than possibly any other person in history, but only its most bitter and misguided aspects. He was like a scholar of human nature who had been granted access to the world's most comprehensive library, but could only read the complaint section. By day 3, Marcus had developed what he privately called envy fatigue, a psychological condition he was pretty sure existed nowhere in medical literature, but was definitely real enough to make him want to move to a cave somewhere and live as a hermit. The constant bombardment of other people's resentful thoughts was like being forced to listen to the world's most depressing radio station, where every song was about why someone else's life was better than yours. But Marcus was nothing if not persistent, especially when it came to avoiding actual work. So he decided to dive deeper into his accidental research project. What he discovered over the next several days would fundamentally change his understanding of human nature and possibly give him a nervous breakdown in the process. The first major breakthrough came when he realized that envious thoughts followed predictable patterns based on social proximity. People weren't randomly envious, they were strategically envious. A struggling artist wasn't envious of Marcus's IT job. They were envious of other artists who seemed to be making it work. A single person wasn't envious of his solitude. They were envious of people in relationships who seemed happy. It was like humanity had organized itself into invisible competitive brackets, and everyone was only comparing themselves to people in their perceived category. Marcus, by virtue of being aggressively average, had somehow ended up in everyone's comparison bracket simultaneously. He was just successful enough to trigger envy from people who felt stuck, but just unsuccessful enough to avoid the resentment reserved for people who were obviously winning at life. This revelation led Marcus to what he would later describe as his golden mean theory of enviability. There was apparently a sweet spot of life circumstances that maximized the amount of envy you received, successful enough to seem like you had options, but not so successful that people wrote you off as being in a completely different league. It was like being the most envied person at a gathering of people who were all equally convinced they were falling behind in life. Marcus tested this theory by visiting different social environments and paying attention to who attracted the most envious thoughts. At a high-end restaurant, nobody was envious of the obviously wealthy diners. They were envious of the couple at the middle-tier table who seemed to be enjoying expensive food without apparent financial stress. At a community college, students weren't envious of professors with PhDs. They were envious of other students who seemed to understand the material effortlessly. The pattern was consistent. People were most envious of others who appear to have achieved a slightly better version of their own lives. Not a completely different life. That would be too overwhelming. But their same life with the rough edges smoothed out. This discovery sent Marcus into what he would later refer to as his existential spiral week. If everyone was envious of people who seemed to have a slightly better version of their own situation, and if those people were simultaneously envious of others who seemed to have figured out something they hadn't, then the entire human experience was essentially an elaborate Ponzi scheme of imagined contentment. Everyone was trying to achieve a state of being that they believed existed somewhere, just slightly ahead of where they currently were. The college student was envious of the graduate. The graduate was envious of the professional. The professional was envious of the manager. The manager was envious of the executive. The executive was envious of the entrepreneur. The entrepreneur was envious of the person who could work a simple job and go home at 5 without worrying about market fluctuations and employee retention. It was a perfect circle of dissatisfaction, where everyone was chasing a version of success that always seemed to be one step ahead, like a philosophical treadmill designed by someone with a particularly cruel sense of humor. Marcus spent an entire afternoon in the city's financial district, listening to the envious thoughts of people who made more money in a month than he made in a year. Investment bankers were envious of entrepreneurs who seemed to have creative freedom. Entrepreneurs were envious of investment bankers who had stable paychecks. Partners at law firms were envious of solo practitioners who didn't have to deal with office politics. Solo practitioners were envious of people in big firms who had resources and support systems. And somehow, scattered throughout this symphony of high-earning anxiety, were occasional thoughts about Marcus himself. People envying his apparent freedom from the pressure of maintaining an expensive lifestyle, his presumed ability to find satisfaction in simple pleasures, his supposed lack of concern about status and social climbing. The absurdity reached peak levels when Marcus overheard a billionaire, an actual billionaire, walking out of a building that probably cost more than some small country's GDP, thinking envious thoughts about a street musician who seemed free from the burden of managing wealth and the constant pressure of financial responsibility. At that moment, Marcus realized he wasn't just observing human nature. He was documenting the fundamental tragedy of the human condition. Everyone, regardless of their circumstances, was convinced that happiness existed somewhere else, in someone else's life, in someone else's definition of success. The street musician, it turned out, was envious of people with stable income and health insurance. The billionaire was envious of people who could enjoy simple pleasures without worrying about the complex responsibilities that came with extreme wealth. Both were looking at Marcus and assuming he had somehow achieved a balance they couldn't manage. This led to what Marcus called his mirror theory of human misery. Everyone was essentially looking at everyone else as a mirror, but instead of seeing their own reflection, they were seeing a distorted image of what their life could be if only they had figured out that one secret thing that everyone else seemed to know. The most disturbing part wasn't that people were envious. It was that their envy was almost always based on completely incorrect assumptions about other people's internal experiences. The billionaire wasn't wrong to think that having less money might mean less stress, but he was wrong to assume that Marcus had actually achieved some kind of Zen-like acceptance of financial limitations. The street musician wasn't wrong to want financial security, but they were wrong to assume that Marcus felt secure. Everyone was envious of fictional emotional states that existed only in their imagination. Marcus began to feel like he was trapped in a psychological horror movie, where the monster was humanity's collective inability to accurately assess what other people's lives were actually like. He was the sole witness to the most comprehensive misunderstanding in human history, and nobody would ever believe him if he tried to explain it. The weight of this knowledge was becoming unbearable. Marcus had stumbled onto the source code of human unhappiness, and it was far more absurd and tragic than any philosopher had ever imagined. People weren't unhappy because their lives were objectively bad. They were unhappy because they were constantly comparing their internal experience to their imagination of other people's internal experiences. And those imaginations were almost always wrong. 3 weeks into his involuntary career as humanity's most specialized mind reader, Marcus made a discovery that would have profound implications for his understanding of consciousness, society, and why everyone seemed perpetually convinced they were doing life wrong. He was sitting in a crowded mall food court, feeling like an anthropologist studying a particularly complex social ritual, when he noticed something strange about the pattern of envious thoughts. They weren't random. They weren't even particularly personal. They were following social scripts so predictable that Marcus began to suspect he could write an algorithm to generate them. Single people were envious of couples, but only couples who appeared to be in the early stages of romance. Couples were envious of families, but only families with small children who still looked manageable. Families with small children were envious of families with teenagers who seemed independent. Families with teenagers were envious of empty nesters who appear to have rediscovered freedom. Empty nesters were envious of single people who seemed unencumbered by decades of emotional baggage. It was like everyone had been handed the same life manual, but each person was convinced they were on the wrong page while everyone else had somehow figured out the correct sequence of chapters. Marcus decided to test his theory by following individual people throughout their day, collecting their envious thoughts like a particularly obsessive sociologist. He chose a woman in her 30s who seemed to represent the slightly successful professional demographic that generated so much envy in others. At 7 a.m., she was thinking envious thoughts about people who could sleep in. At 9 a.m., she was envious of colleagues who seemed less stressed about deadlines. At noon, she was envious of people who could enjoy lunch without checking their phones. At 3 p.m., she was envious of people who seemed to love their jobs. At 6 p.m., she was envious of people who had someone to go home to. At 8 p.m., she was envious of people who seemed content spending evenings alone. The woman was essentially cycling through a daily routine of envy, hitting all the major life categories like she was following a predetermined schedule of dissatisfaction. And the most remarkable part was that other people, observing her throughout the day, were envious of her apparent competence, independence, and success. This led Marcus to what he would later call his performance theory of human existence. Everyone was essentially performing a role they didn't feel qualified for, while simultaneously envying others who seemed more naturally suited to their assigned parts in the grand theater of adult life. The businesswoman was performing successful professionalism, while envying people who seemed genuinely confident in professional settings. The stay-at-home parent was performing nurturing contentment, while envying people who seemed naturally maternal or paternal. The artist was performing creative authenticity, while envying people who seemed to have found their true calling without struggling with self-doubt. Everyone was acting out their life, while envying others who seemed to be living their lives more naturally. Marcus realized he had discovered something that would revolutionize psychology, sociology, and possibly the entire field of human services. The majority of human suffering wasn't caused by objective circumstances, but by the gap between people's internal experience of uncertainty and their perception of everyone else's certainty. The college student struggling with calculus wasn't primarily frustrated by calculus. They were frustrated by the assumption that other students found calculus intuitive. The new parent wasn't primarily overwhelmed by childcare. They were overwhelmed by the assumption that other parents had natural instincts that they were lacking. The professional wasn't primarily stressed by work demands. They were stressed by the assumption that successful people handled similar demands with ease. This revelation sent Marcus into what his future therapist would probably classify as an acute philosophical crisis. He was walking around with definitive proof that most human misery was based on a fundamental misunderstanding. But he was the only person who could see it, and the knowledge was making him profoundly sad. Because here's what he realized. Even if he could somehow share this information with the world, it probably wouldn't help. People's envy wasn't rational enough to be solved by rational explanations. Knowing that everyone else was also struggling with self-doubt wouldn't automatically make someone feel more confident. Understanding that everyone else was also making it up as they went along wouldn't instantly cure imposter syndrome. The envious thoughts Marcus heard weren't really about wanting what other people had. They were about wanting to feel the way they imagined other people felt. And since those feelings were largely fictional, they were essentially impossible to achieve. Marcus spent an entire weekend walking through different neighborhoods, collecting envious thoughts like a melancholic sociologist documenting the geography of human dissatisfaction. In wealthy neighborhoods, people were envious of those who seemed to enjoy luxury without guilt. In modest neighborhoods, people were envious of those who seemed content with simplicity without feeling like they were settling. In diverse communities, people were envious of those who seemed to navigate cultural complexity effortlessly. In homogeneous communities, people were envious of those who seemed to find richness in familiarity without feeling provincial. Every single demographic, every income level, every life stage, every cultural background, all of them convinced that some other group had figured out the secret to emotional satisfaction that they were missing. Marcus began to understand that he wasn't just hearing envious thoughts. He was listening to humanity's collective confession of inadequacy. Every envious thought was essentially someone admitting, "I don't feel like I'm doing this right, and I assume that person is." The tragedy wasn't that people were envious. The tragedy was that they were envious of something that didn't exist anywhere except in their own imagination. After a month of involuntary mind reading, Marcus had reached what philosophers might call enlightenment, and what his doctor would probably call a breakdown. The constant exposure to humanity's envious thoughts had given him a perspective on human nature that was both profound and profoundly disturbing. He had become accustomed to the daily symphony of resentment that surrounded him everywhere he went. The barista envying his presumed freedom from customer service. The businessman envying his apparent lack of corporate pressure. The student envying his distance from academic stress. It was like living inside a meditation on the first noble truth of Buddhism. Life is suffering, except Buddha had probably never imagined suffering could be quite this absurd. The breakthrough came when Marcus realized he could use his curse as a form of social GPS. Envious thoughts were essentially mapping out what people valued most, what they felt they were missing, and what they believed would make them happy. He was like an accidental researcher conducting the world's most comprehensive survey on human desire and dissatisfaction. Marcus decided to test whether this information could actually be useful. He started small, helping his neighbor Mrs. Rodriguez, who was constantly thinking envious thoughts about people who seemed to have meaningful social connections. Instead of just avoiding her in the hallway, Marcus started making small talk. It turned out she was lonely and appreciated even brief interactions. He began bringing coffee to Dave from accounting, who was envious of people who seemed to have thoughtful friends. He volunteered to help the college student in his building with her computer problems, since she was constantly envying people who seemed to understand technology effortlessly. What Marcus discovered was that most people's envious thoughts revealed genuine needs that could often be addressed through surprisingly simple actions. The barista didn't really want Marcus's life. She wanted recognition that her job was difficult and that she was doing it well. The businessman didn't actually want Marcus's freedom from responsibility. He wanted someone to acknowledge that his responsibilities were stressful. People weren't envying other circumstances as much as they were envying the imagined emotional support, recognition, and understanding that they believed those circumstances provided. This led to Marcus's final and most important discovery. Envy was actually a deeply misguided form of emotional intelligence. It was people accurately identifying their own needs, but completely misunderstanding how those needs could be met. The person envying someone else's confidence didn't need to become that person. They needed experiences that would build their own confidence. The person envying someone else's relationships didn't need those specific relationships. They needed to develop their own capacity for connection. Marcus began to see envious thoughts as encrypted messages about human needs. Once decoded, they revealed a surprisingly detailed map of what people were actually seeking: recognition, security, connection, purpose, autonomy, competence, and belonging. Armed with this insight, Marcus started what he privately called the Envy Translation Project. When he heard someone thinking envious thoughts, he tried to identify the underlying need and see if there was a way to address it directly. The results were remarkable. People began to seem less envious around him, not because their circumstances had dramatically improved, but because their underlying emotional needs were being acknowledged and partially met through genuine human interaction. Marcus realized he had stumbled onto something that could revolutionize how people understood happiness and social connection. Most human misery wasn't caused by having the wrong life. It was caused by misunderstanding what would actually improve the life you had. But the most profound change was in Marcus himself. Focusing on other people's genuine needs had gradually freed him from his own cycle of envy and dissatisfaction. He was still perfectly average, still worked in IT support, still lived in a modest apartment. But he no longer felt like he was failing at life, because he finally understood that everyone else was making it up as they went along too. The constant stream of envious thoughts had become less overwhelming, not because there were fewer of them, but because Marcus now heard them differently. Instead of a chorus of resentment, they sounded like requests for help, admission of vulnerability, and expressions of very human needs for connection and understanding. Marcus had accidentally become the world's first emotional translator, converting humanity's complaints into a language of genuine need and mutual support. It wasn't the superpower he would have chosen, but it might have been exactly the superpower the world needed. And sometimes, late at night in his perfectly average apartment, Marcus would wonder if this was how empathy actually worked for everyone. Not mind reading, but the ability to hear what people really needed beneath what they were actually saying. Maybe he hadn't gained a supernatural ability at all. Maybe he had just learned to listen. So here's what Marcus learned from his month as humanity's accidental envy detector. We're all walking around convinced that everyone else received a life manual that we somehow miss getting. We're envious of fictional emotional states that exist only in our imagination of other people's experiences. And most of our dissatisfaction comes from comparing our internal reality to our assumptions about everyone else's internal reality. But perhaps the most beautiful discovery was that underneath all that envy was a profound human need for connection, recognition, and understanding. People weren't really wanting other people's lives. They were wanting to feel seen, valued, and less alone in their struggles. Marcus still hears envious thoughts every day, but now they sound less like complaints and more like invitations. Opportunities to offer the recognition, support, and human connection that everyone is desperately seeking but rarely knows how to ask for directly. Maybe the real superpower isn't reading minds. Maybe it's learning to hear what people actually need and finding ways to help them feel less alone in this beautifully absurd human experience we're all figuring out together. And if that thought makes you want to share this story with someone who might need to hear it, well, maybe you're developing that superpower too.